Hello and welcome to Beyond Top 10 Tennis. My name is Dr. Ashley Morgan-Berge and I'm your host. I'm the author of 11 books, the CEO of 12 years, the founder of a startup set on data privacy, most importantly an elite performance coach of over 18 years, having worked with athletes throughout Europe, the United States to Australia. And I guess most excitingly, I am the world's leading scientist on coach and athlete performance behind uncovering how to develop a top 10 tennis ranking. And look, we touch on this each and every episode and it's so exciting, and I'm so incredibly fortunate to be that one behind that, because with a background as a former player and coach, it's just so exciting to be able to share and unravel what it really takes and really dig deeper and share about the pathway to the long game towards that top 10 tennis ranking. My work includes mitigating injuries through to that pathway to developing that top 10 tennis ranking, and the player and the coach, which is really important to be mindful of. I'm behind theories from the optimal performance theory, the V by Dr. Berge to the rule of transference. I've coined terms from the barrier breaker to the golden rule and a slew of others. And look, as has become custom, with each episode, we dive into one of my books and we really dig a bit deeper to share those additional insights. And believe it or not, we are up to episode 30. So for those of you who have been with us from the very beginning, thank you so much from the bottom of my heart. Part of me can't really believe we've made it this far, but I really hope this is just the beginning. And look, if you are just joining us, thank you so much. To keep pace, check out the prior episodes because they're just jammed packed with really just great stuff, additional nuggets when we're really talking about how to develop that top 10 tennis player. And look, today's no different. We're digging into a topic that is just so important and I'm looking forward to it. So as always, buckle in and enjoy the ride. Thank you so much for joining us. Again, like I said in the intro, I can't believe we've made it to 30 episodes. I've had a lot of fun, and look, if you've been with us from the very beginning, I really hope you have been too. And again, like I've said, if this is your first time tuning in, thank you so much. But have a look at our previous episodes, catch up, have some fun along the way, and that's, I guess, what's made us or built where we are today. And look, today's episode's really building on the previous episodes, because recall, we're really focusing on the chapter around, that learning process. So it's irrespective if, we're talking about the developmental athlete or that athlete who is on tour, but specifically, let's say ranked top 50 in the world, top 40 in the world, and looking to ascend towards the top 100. And it's really important to be mindful that this body of work, it's applicable irrespective of where you are on that performance spectrum. And you can look at the ranking, for example, but there is an incredible body of players who obviously do not have that ranking yet, that they're still developing. And for those of you out there, I really want to share, I guess, some key information around that, is that if you are not a junior Grand Slam champion, before you're 16, 17, it's okay. It does not mean that's not the case, obviously, in your later years. And the same applies, I think, for the level of pressure to needing to compete on that world stage from an early age. Because ironically, and believe it or not, that doesn't essentially transfer and assimilate with a top 10 tennis ranking in those later years. And it's ironic when we say later years because, we're talking about that, that 14, 15, 16-year-old excelling. And we're looking at, obviously, when you're 24, 25, 26, and you're edging towards that peak, it's okay. And it's so important to remember that those peaks are cyclical, but they also happen over time. And look, if you've been following along for some time now, that means you're familiar with that 10-year pathway, which essentially means that's a minimum of 10 years of development. So that's essentially, you know, if you start at 8, 9 years of age, you're looking at 18, 19 before you reach that certain peak. And look, this is in most cases. There obviously are exceptions to the rule. And then that sets you up for that next 10 years. So one of my books, it's called I Am Your Tennis Coaching Guru, and for good reason, because there's a play on words there, because it's looking at that 20-year pathway. So it's essentially the 10 years that come first, that build those foundations, to the 10 years that come later. And that means you could be peaking at that 28, 29 years of age. And that's just a ballpark again, because we have a lot of players these days that obviously continue playing through their mid to even late 30s, and even older in some cases. And I mean, in retrospect, that's still relatively young when we're looking at obviously the individual, because we do like taking that humanized approach here. And irrespective if you are that tennis player or not, obviously everyone's still human. So we really try to pull out obviously where we can relate off the tennis court specifically, and what we can obviously transfer onto. And obviously that's reciprocal, because obviously there are lessons that are interchanged there. But look, today's episode is actually titled Learning from Mistakes for the Players. And if you want to follow along, we are on page 157. But before I begin to share, I think, you know, key segments there and share those additional insights, I think, again, it's like our previous episodes. There is so much we can learn here, I think, in life, in and of itself, not just on the tennis court, when we're talking about those mistakes and obviously learning from those mistakes. And that's really where that humanized approach comes in, because it doesn't matter if you are, you know, that tennis player, that athlete, you know, the parent, the guardian, or the coach. We all make mistakes because we're all human. No one out there is absolutely perfect. Obviously, if you think you are, you say you are, you know, more power to you. But at the same time, obviously, I think it's incredibly powerful when you can recognize those mistakes, because that means you're giving yourself the space to learn. And when we're able to learn from, I guess, those mistakes and what we can improve on, that also allows us to improve our performance. Because at the end of the day, if we think, obviously, that we're not making a mistake, or that obviously everything we're doing is perfect, then we really don't have those markers to, I guess, progress against and or towards. And that, I think, is really fundamental when we're talking about that learning process. So irrespective, again, whether that's obviously in life, because if you are that coach, the mistakes happen. If you're that parent, that guardian, oh my goodness, you know those mistakes happen. But again, when you are that player, it can be a bit tough, obviously, in those early years, so those developmental years. Specifically, let's focus on those adolescent years. And there is that really big tendency to be too hard on ourselves. And we can learn a lot from that, from our parents and or guardians and our coaches, of how not to be so hard on ourselves, but essentially to take away, I guess, those golden nuggets that are hidden there. And what I mean there is that the parents, the guardians, those coaches, so let's say the adults in the room, can lead by example. And that's when we're saying, you know what, you made that mistake, but this is what we can learn from it. Because this is how, when we're looking from that, you know, that performances perspective, how an athlete grows and they develop, because obviously their performance, the one they're really after, is not in sync with their results. And that's obviously how we move the marker closer and we ascend closer towards that top 10 tennis ranking, irrespective again what your ranking is at any given time. And that's really fundamental to be mindful of that. So again, when we're looking at how we learn, when we learn from mistakes, it's really important to begin with to be mindful of recognizing that it's a good thing. It's a really good thing if we're able to make mistakes in this sense for good reason, because that means we're open and there's that opportunity there to just dig a bit deeper and learn even further. Okay, so before I get too carried away on that topic, let's get started. Let's dive into the chapter. So again, if you want to follow along, we're on page 157. Too often than not, I find players beating themselves up over mistakes they make on the court and or field. Whether it is an forced error, a misjudged ball toss, heavy feet, or the outcome of a game match, players are almost never satisfied if this is how they are conditioned. And I think that's obviously what we're talking about here, because it's the conditioning proponent there. So it's what that parent, that guardian, that coach, the examples that are being set and those reactions. And look, here's a personal story I'll share, and I'm definitely not proud of this one, but look, I can share this as an adult, being able to share that I know better. Growing up playing, it was almost frowned upon if you were not angry at yourself if you did not get the results. I was at an academy where players used to hit themselves on the legs, on the arms, with their rackets, quite hard. And if that was the case now, that's just not okay. But never did I ever see a coach step in to say no. It was almost encouraged, so much so that it was assimilated with effort. That if you were not happy with your performance, that was effort, that you were upset with yourself, so you wanted to push further. And those players unfortunately got more attention. So then I found myself doing the same thing, whether it was hurting myself on the leg like these players, and I'll preface this that they were better than me. Not that we obviously like saying that, but they were there at a higher level. And it also went to go with throwing the racket and breaking rackets. It was not okay. And we're talking about athletes specifically, let's say, between that 12 years of age to that 16 years of age. And that's a really pivotal, that learning curve that we're looking at, and it's setting those foundations. And look, you only have to look on, the ATP to WTA tours to see the precedents that have been set and the poor behaviors that are obviously associated there, and the rewards, unfortunately, at times that come with that. And obviously, if you're a player and you're listening and you think this is okay, please stop. It's not okay. If you're a coach, come on. You know it's not okay. Parents guarding, it's not okay. Obviously, if you're on the same page as me, thank you so much. But it's just an example to share about, obviously, that conditioning process and what players and athletes can be exposed to and or what they're used to. And that's really sad. And that, I think, it's so fundamental when we're looking at that process and the stage of development and those, those personal attributes to behaviours there that are tied to that outcome. We really want to set the foundations for those healthy attitudes on how they can obviously behave in that respect. This type of conditioning is unhealthy. It is definitely an asset for players and athletes alike to question their performances and to endeavour to always learn from their mistakes. However, nitpicking on each little piece or part of a performance is not. And I think that's what I'm getting to and or at, and it really is obviously that nitpicking and being really, I think, harsh on yourself and or as that player, and that it's not okay. And again, it comes down to that precedence and what has been set, because again, it really depends on the role models and what the scene that's being set to begin with. blowing caution to the wind here for coaches to take note. Please hold off on nitpicking a player's performance at the developmental level. Focus on the main tasks at hand. This is also the key for the player to focus on. For example, if a player loses a game or match and they played poorly, pull only a handful of things out, no more than 3, and deliver constructive feedback. Now, this is so important because more often than not, and especially this was my experience too growing up, and I do see this is still the case today, unfortunately, for a lot of, I think, coaches and athletes out there, is that the feedback is obviously given and the congratulations once the win has had, and only if that win is obviously that end result. That rarely do I see congratulations or that really positive feedback if the result was a loss, but the player actually played really well. And you recall the previous episode around intent and obviously purpose there. And if your intent and your purpose for that match was to work on a certain specific proponent of your game, and you did, and you executed that exceptionally, you should be so proud of yourself. And that coach, the parent, the guardian, that support network around you should be equally just as proud. And I think that's where that discussion around feedback can get really skewed at times. Because look, on the flip side, if your performance, it really wasn't what you're after, it was negative, okay? It was not good. As that coach, you can still pull out those positives. There is still a way to share, obviously, I think that the less than desirable proponents, obviously, to that game, to that performance, but it's still so important to be able to acknowledge and deliver that feedback in a really good light. But again, when we're looking at the behaviors and the ones that have been conditioned, and if you're that coach, that parent, that guardian who supports obviously that child, that player, athlete throwing their racket or screaming or any other, I think, negative connotation associated with a given behavior there, I think you really need to consider those core values and ethics to begin with, which, you know, we're going to leave that to another episode, or I'm sure I've touched on that, you know, in the past. And it's just so important, again, when we're looking at that triangular approach, the role of that parent, the coach, and the player, that everyone's obviously on the same page. But when we're really looking at learning from our mistakes, and for the players, it's the precedent. And that's where that coach, that parent, that dynamic, it comes into play, because it really is leading by example, but it's showing what is acceptable and what not. If you're at a club or an academy and you're saying it's acceptable for a player to hit themselves, to throw their racket, to chuck a tantrum, and then they get rewarded or they get all the attention, are you setting a good precedent there? Because I would argue, I would differ, obviously, extremely there. And I think these are the warning signs. I mean, I cannot tell you how many clubs and academies I have been at over the years, and even more recently, where those negative behaviors are rewarded, essentially, and they are not pulled up on, because it's so important to make sure we can still learn from our mistakes in a positive light, and that the attention is there and that it's given in a positive light, opposed to, I'm going to reward you because you're chucking a tantrum, so you must really care. Because children, players, athletes, they trust me. They still care deeply if they're not chucking a tantrum. They really do. Because again, a lot of my work obviously has crossed over into child development with that performance spectrum, and obviously the behaviors associated with that, along again that developmental spectrum. And it's so fundamental, because look, at the end of the day, we wouldn't know how to develop the best players in the world if the capacity was not there to look at those learning inferences along the way. So, and this is what we really talk about, and this is what my work really looks to address, because it's those habitual behaviors there, and it's those behaviors that are learned at a very young age, prior to and during those adolescent years, that really shapes that player athlete, and why we can really set the stage for the long game throughout those years. And trust me, if you have an athlete, a player who's in their 20s, they were once an adolescent too. So there really are key behaviors that would have been learned throughout that phase. Now, this isn't to take away, obviously, from their performance in any way, shape, or form. This is saying that when we're looking at that pathway and developing that top 10 tennis ranking, when we're looking at, learning from our mistakes, the earlier we're able to integrate these type of behaviors, this positive feedback mechanism, we're setting that player athlete up for success long term. Players who obviously are elite at this stage, which whether that's top 100, top 40, top 20, even top 10, there are still behaviors that obviously have worked for them and progressed them towards the top 10, but I guarantee you there are still players inside the top 10 where those behaviors have not served them. So there's a very good chance that they're going to regress, because again, if you've read one of my latest texts, What is your game missing to win? For example, it's a series there that touches on why players inside the top 10 are displaced, that not all of them maintain that ranking. And this goes on both ATP and WTA tours. There's obviously, there is no bias there in respect to gender. It happens on obviously both sides here. And it's so important to be mindful of this and the role of that conditioning process, and especially when we have that opportunity to learn from those mistakes, and how I guess that feedback shapes us and what we can learn from that. And this isn't to say positive feedback all the time. You can still give negative feedback in a very mindful way that athlete, that player is able to learn from. And it's so key and fundamental. Again, if you've read up on the 7 keys, and that text is the 7 keys to optimize your life, in there we have those nuggets that we talk about, which are essentially obviously those keys that are responsible for developing that top 10 tennis ranking. And they're not just technical. It's not just obviously those technical proponents that are responsible for that result. There's a lot more to it. And I guess this is what this chapter really, I think, talks to and speaks about. It's when we really want to learn from our mistakes, it's really up to, that coach-athlete dynamic, that the communication there, what works, that individualization that we've touched on, through to those modifications, whether it's modifications in training, in practice, and or through play to achieve the desired outcome. It's really constantly working towards that. And when we say that, it's, what's your purpose, the intent, as the previous episode, because at the end of the day, everything's really tied together. When we're looking at developing, obviously, that elite echelon of play, so that player athlete with the capacity to maintain their hold on the top 10. And I think I just get so passionate about this because we know it's possible, and I see so many players and athletes struggling alongside their parents because they don't have access to why. What do I need to do to get my child to this level? And for the coaches out there, please upskill. The texts are there, and I've touched on this in one of the previous episodes, so I won't go into it, but that we know, and I've touched on why they're available, for example, through AMA International, because it's been designed in that way for you, to give you access. Because I cannot tell you how many parents over the years who have come to me almost in heartache because they know that their child aspires to become a professional athlete, but there are roadblocks, also those injuries that happen. And when we're looking at the 7 keys, obviously we know how to mitigate those injuries by ensuring we have those more conducive performance parameters, for example, which are absolutely fundamental. But again, these are simple mistakes, and from the coach's perspective, it's how do you learn from those mistakes? And that's absolutely pivotal when we're reaching, obviously, those players, those performance metrics, and how we get there, how to tweak those minute technical parameters to achieve that end goal. In order for players to learn from their mistakes, this is what is needed: not criticism that affects their self-worth as an athlete. If players are not given constructive feedback, they don't know where to start. Quite literally, they think they suck and can get into unhealthy mindsets. These mindsets can and should be avoided. They are detrimental to player performance and longevity. And look, this really talks to, I think, everything that I've addressed in this respect, whether it's those habitual behaviors, the conditioning process, the mistakes that can be made, obviously the parents' role, the coach's role, everything really comes down to this. And it's those attitudes that child, that adolescent carries with them, irrespective, obviously, of their ranking now. Because you could have a player ranked top 50 and they're doing almost everything right, just almost. But we know that the 7 keys, they're just not there. Maybe partially, but they're not there. And one of the biggest roadblocks, one of the biggest hurdles that's stopping them are those non-conducive behaviors and those attitudes that have been integrated or almost infiltrated in a way in those earlier years. And that player, that athlete, still holds on to those beliefs that has been affecting their self-worth, that has been holding them back. And it really is obviously that coach's responsibility to get to the bottom of that, to unstuck that, whatever that happens to be, and to relearn. So whether it's not necessarily a mistake in this respect, but it's figuring out what that block is, to almost free that player, that athlete, to allow them to reach their full potential. And this is something that's not obviously discussed. It's not very popular to discuss. Again, one of my theories is optimal behavior for optimal performance. And again, that's in the text, the 7 keys to optimize your life. But essentially that talks to, you need to build those optimal behaviors to produce those optimal performances. And if you are not capable of learning from your mistakes, that does not happen, which means no, obviously becoming a top 10 tennis player is not on the cards. So we want to progress towards the top 10, and we go, how do we do that? And what is the role of the mistakes here? Well, mistakes, and obviously the learning from them, is a behavior. So it's a behavior you can choose. You can choose to learn from those mistakes or not. You just continue, obviously, along the pathway. So we know if the work is done to build those behaviors, then you're set, almost you're free to build those optimal performances. But how do you know to begin with? And this is a really delicate and intricate part where the elite coaches come in. So really to learn more about what it takes to become an elite coach, that's the 7 keys. And obviously the science of elite performance dives into that in very extensive detail. But we have limited time here, so we really want to focus on those behaviors and how. So if you are a coach listening, it's really about building that trustworthy relationship with the player, the athlete there, to be able to get them to share. And again, especially irrespective if it is that adolescent age group or older. So if you're 18, 19, early 20s, even later in some cases, it's really important to acknowledge there's something that needs to get unstuck. They're stuck and we want to unstick them in a really obviously simplified way there. But it can be, again, really intricate and complex to just dig deeper, or what it is, whether they have the core belief that no, that their technique has to do this, their elbow needs to do this, their hips need to do this, oh no, they're not meant to do this with their lower body, or no, their upper, it doesn't matter. There's going to be a lot of things there, and it's really about knuckling down what is not conducive to building that optimal performance. And it could be something, again, because we've touched on that humanized approach, it could be something off the tennis court that they're struggling with that is holding them back. And people might go, well, that's not the coach's responsibility. And let me tell you, it actually is, because the coach is more than that. When we're looking at building towards that top 10 tennis ranking, it's the same with the coach. The coach needs to represent that top 10 tennis player, which means obviously all of the modalities that come with that. And we look at, the 7 didactic modes, for example. And it's really that to build a top 10 tennis player, it's reciprocal with having that coach that allows them to reach that peak performance. And again, this is really unique to that relationship, so to that coach-athlete relationship. It does not necessarily mean, or it's almost quite to the contrary, that it will happen with that coach and another player. That's not the case. We're really looking at this individual occasion, this individual inference between a player and a coach, and the intricate relationship between them, where they're really able to work together to really hone in on those 7 keys and pull back. What are those mistakes there? What do you need to learn? What have you been conditioned to? How can we recondition that and pull that out, dig deeper to build that optimal performance? And I know it sounds like a lot, but in retrospect, it's really about having those conversations, being mindful of, I guess, is that criticism warranted? If ever, what type of feedback is conducive? Is it constructive, that we've touched on? Does that athlete, that player, think they suck? Why? Get behind that, because no player athlete should ever think they suck. And no, if you're an elite player and you are publicizing that you think you suck, please ask yourself if that's a good example to set, players 10 years your junior. Because I'm sure you can agree with me that that's not the way to go. So when we're really looking at building, again, those healthy mindsets, it's really about building that confidence in the player, establishing, I guess, boundaries in a really healthy way of how they can learn from mistakes, but in a really, I think, conscious and mindful way to ensure, like I touched on, that the player has longevity for their performance, because there is so much lost talent between those developmental years. But also you can look at junior Grand Slam champions, because look, we started today's discussion around that, and you really need to ask yourself why. Ask yourself seriously, why is not every single player that is at a junior Grand Slam, why are those performances not transferred on tour? Because essentially you would see whether it's, 10, 20 players every year who are in the top 20, let's say their performance metrics are at that junior Grand Slam level, we should essentially see them just progressing through the top 100 towards the top 50 over that 3, 4, 5 year period. But that's not the case. That is not what is seen, because those performances are not progressed. They often stagnate, or they often reach a plateau. So those players, those juniors who are peaking at that age, more often than not are the ones who unintentionally settle. So reach that plateau around that 90, 80, 70 in the world, and are not equipped. So they lack the tools to progress further. And that's obviously where the 7 keys come in to unstuck you in that respect. And I know that's not very good English there, but I think you're following along that perspective. So it's really, I think, fundamental and pertinent to be able to look at those developmental performance metrics and how they transfer long term, because that's what we're really talking about. That obviously those initial 10 years, setting that player up for success for those next 10 years. And it's not about achieving your optimal peak within those first 10. It's setting the player up. And a lot of coaches can unfortunately be misguided here, and parents as well. And it's one thing to peak at that junior level, and nothing's wrong with it. So please do not misinterpret my words here. That's obviously exceptional, but it's absolutely critical to continue along that pathway. And so what I'm sharing is that normally there's a block where that adolescent, that developmental player athlete gets stuck. There's a block. So this inhibits them from progressing and reaching the same level of success on the WTA/ATP tour, so obviously at the senior level, which sounds a bit ironic saying senior when it's really, plays late teens, 20s. But I hope you're following along in this context. And that's where it's so pivotal. If we're able to condition the children at that age that are then those players, those athletes in the later years, so in the early to late 20s, even the 30s in a lot of cases now, if we can condition them with those conducive behaviors where they're able to learn from those mistakes in a positive light, in a more mindful way, not only are we setting them up for success long term, we're able to give them the tools and the skills, obviously once they become privy to the 7 keys, to continuously work on that, develop that, evolve their game with those skills, with those tools. So we're setting them up to align with optimal behavior for optimal performance, whilst, and obviously here it comes, yes, while setting them up to progress, to ascend towards that top 10 tennis ranking. Thank you so much for listening today. Look, to grab a copy of The Secrets to Optimal Performance Success, head on over to AM8 International. That is am8international.com. And I really hope it was clear, obviously, from the very beginning. Look, if this was your first episode, that's obviously the book that we've been diving into. And obviously the full title is The Secrets to Optimal Performance Success, a comprehensive discussion on developing elite coaches and players, but that obviously is shared in the episode notes, which maybe you took a peek at beforehand. If not, they're there. And as always, I obviously leave all of the links in those episode notes. For any comments or questions, obviously please do head on over to AM8 or Topic Thread. That's the only social network that I am out on. And look, just quickly, I know we wrapped today up quite abruptly in a way, and I did get quite passionate about this topic. I think we started off in a more simple light, and then we really knuckled down, because learning and mistakes, it's just so involved, but it's also so simple. But we can really dive deeper when we're looking at obviously that behavioral element there, and the role that plays in producing those optimal performances. It's quite extensive and exciting, and a lot of my work obviously talks around that, because we know, and the data obviously tells us, that it's not just technical. There's so much more, because again, we do like taking that humanized approach, which is often forgotten because athletes, players, they are humans. So it's so important, I think, to get our heads around this, to apply this, especially if we're looking at building that top 10 tennis ranking. If you do have additional comments or questions, Beyond Top 10 Tennis is on a lot of social platforms now, whether it's Threads, Medium, we have our blogs on, and obviously on AMA as well. TikTok, we have those weekly coaching tips that happen a few times during the week. But look, you'll also find us on Twitter and Instagram too. So please come and say hi. For something different, my fictional release is on Pink Octopus Books. Again, all links are going to be in the bio, so in the show notes. And if you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe, like, follow. That would be absolutely phenomenal. For those of you who already have, thank you so much. If this is one of your first times tuning in, please don't be shy. And again, look, if you're listening on Spotify, we do have those polls and questions, so please feel welcome to fill them out, share your thoughts there, because I do personally read all of them and they do help shape future episodes. And look, on that note, thank you so much. I am so grateful. I am your host, Dr. Ashley Morgan Berge, and this is Beyond Top 10 Tennis, and I'll see you next time.